The dog did not choose Harrow's Bay any more than the freezing rain did. But by spring both had settled into Weston Colt's life so completely that neither the man nor the town could quite remember what silence had sounded like before him. Weston was 54, though the ropes of muscle still corded along his forearms made him look a decade younger, at least until someone caught his eyes. Those had aged on their own schedule, somewhere far past 54, somewhere out past the edge of what most people in Cape Breton had ever had to see. He had come to Nova Scotia 2 years earlier, not because the province had called to him, but because his wife, Anarchy, had asked him once, half joking, half serious, lying in a hospital bed with a tube taped to the back of her hand, whether he would take her home to the water when it was over. She meant the water near Harrow's Bay, the gray Atlantic chop she had grown up watching from her grandmother's kitchen window, long before she'd ever met a Navy SEAL in a bar in Norfolk, Virginia, and decided, against every warning from her friends, that he was worth the risk. Weston had promised her he would. He had not expected the promise to become a life sentence of his own, a small rented house above a defunct chandlery, 6,000 kilometers from anyone who remembered who he used to be. The town knew him only in silhouette. He walked the breakwater every morning before the fishing boats went out, nodded at the harbour master, bought coffee at the same counter, and drank it outside no matter the weather, and returned home before most people had finished their first cup. Doris Whitlock, who lived below him and had buried 2 husbands and outlived every plant she'd ever owned except one stubborn geranium, told her sister on the phone that the American upstairs was polite as a church pew and about as talkative. She did not say it unkindly. She had simply learned, the way the whole street had learned, that Weston Colt answered questions but never asked them, and that when his porch light was on past midnight, it was better not to knock. What none of them knew, what Weston barely let himself know, was that he had spent 14 years doing work that did not allow for grief, work that required him to fold each loss into a compartment and seal it before the next operation began, and that when he had finally retired, the compartments had not stayed shut. 2 years before he ever set foot in Nova Scotia, on a rooftop outside Kandahar, Petty Officer Emmett Sorensen had died 6 feet from him with a joke half-finished in his throat. Something about the coffee back at base being an insult to every nation that had ever grown a bean. Weston had carried him down 4 flights of stairs that no longer existed as stairs so much as rubble with intentions, and he had not cried, not then, not at the funeral, not in the 16 months afterward, when he was still active and still, technically, fine. He had cried exactly once, 3 years later, in a hospital parking lot in Virginia Beach, after a doctor used the word months in a sentence about his wife. Since then, he had rationed his emotions the way a man rations ammunition in a firefight that has already been lost, carefully, sparingly, in case there was worse still coming. It was a Tuesday in late January, the kind of evening the Maritimes specialize in, when the wind off the water carries so much ice in it that it sounds less like weather and more like static. When the message came through on his phone, Fiona Ducey ran the volunteer animal rescue for 3 counties, out of the back of a rusted Ford Explorer, and a spare bedroom that had not held a bed in 11 years. She was 46, sturdy in the shoulders from years of hauling feed bags and stubborn goats, with a laugh that could be heard across a parking lot and a private conviction, which she rarely spoke aloud, that most of the town's men were kinder to animals than they were willing to be to each other. She had met Weston only twice, both times when he'd donated to the shelter's winter fund without ever coming inside to see the dogs he was paying to keep warm. She did not know his history. She only knew from the harbour master that he was ex-military, capable, and, crucially on a night like this, awake. Dog trapped in an old lobster pound off the Cabot Road, past Ingonish. Roofs half-caved from the ice load, nobody can get a truck up there till the plow comes through, could be morning. He won't make it that long. I'm sending you what I've got. Beneath the message was a photograph, grainy, taken by a passing snowplow driver who'd heard barking, and then, worse, had stopped hearing it. A German shepherd puppy, perhaps 3 months old, pressed into the corner of a collapsing wooden pound where fishermen had once kept their catch alive. One wall already caved under the weight of days of freezing rain. His fur was matted flat with ice. His ribs showed through it. His eyes, even through a phone camera in bad light, had the specific, terrible stillness of an animal that has stopped expecting anyone to come. Weston set the phone face down on the counter and did not pick it up again for almost 4 minutes. He told himself in the flat internal voice he used for orders he intended to disobey that this was not his responsibility, that he was 54 years old and tired in a way sleep didn't fix, that the last time he had driven toward someone else's emergency in the dark he had come home with another man's blood dried into the creases of his knuckles. He told himself a great many reasonable things. Then he thought of Anarchy, of the specific fury she'd have aimed at him if she ever caught him rationalizing his way out of helping something small and cold and out of options. And he was already reaching for his coat before he'd finished the thought. The truck fought him the whole way up the Cabot Road. Ice had turned the asphalt into something closer to a frozen river, and twice the back end slid wide enough that Weston felt the old, familiar tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the part of his brain that still expected every skid, every sudden noise, to be the beginning of something worse. He gripped the wheel the way he'd once gripped a rifle sling, knuckles white, breath counted out in 4s, and told the part of himself that wanted to turn around. That turning around was not, this time, an option. The lobster pound sat back from the road behind a stand of black spruce bent nearly sideways by the wind, its collapsed glittering with a crust of ice that caught his headlights and threw them back at him in shards. He killed the engine, stepped out into cold that hit like a physical blow, and heard it before he saw it. Not barking, not anymore, just a thin, exhausted whine coming from somewhere beneath the collapsed timber. Easy, he said, to no one, to himself, to the dark. I'm coming. It took him almost 20 minutes to clear enough of the fallen roof to reach the corner where the puppy had wedged himself, and by the time he did, his hands had gone numb enough that he barely felt the splinters. The dog did not run from him. He did not have the strength to. He simply looked up at Weston with those flat amber eyes, and for one long moment neither of them moved, man and animal regarding each other across a gap that was not really about distance at all. "Come here, then," Weston said, and knelt and held out one bare hand into air cold enough to burn. The puppy's nose touched his palm first, tentative. Then his whole trembling body followed, collapsing forward into Weston's chest, as if some final decision had been made, and there was no longer any reason to hold anything back. Weston wrapped him inside his coat, felt a heartbeat going fast and thin against his own sternum, and carried him back to the truck through wind that seemed for just a few seconds to quiet. He did not decide to name him until they were most of the way home, the puppy curled on the passenger seat in a nest of Weston's spare jacket, still shivering but alive, and the plow lights of a rare late-night salt truck passed them going the other way, illuminating a road sign half buried in drifted snow. Rookiland Road, 4 km. "Rook," Weston said, testing the word out loud in the cab of the truck for the first time in longer than he wanted to think about. The puppy's ear twitched at the sound. That'll do. The first week was mostly silence and slow trust. Rook would not eat unless Weston sat on the floor beside the bowl, would not sleep unless the bedroom door stayed open, flinched hard at sudden movement, and did not bark, not once, not even when Doris's ancient tomcat yowled outside the window at 3 in the morning. Dr. Naomi Okafor, the town's only vet, ran her hands gently over the ridged scar tissue at the base of his neck, the unmistakable pattern of an old rope, worn too tight, for too long, by someone who had never once considered the animal on the other end of it, and told Weston, matter-of-factly, without a trace of sentiment, that the dog was healthy physically, that the rest would take time, and that time, in her experience, was the only medicine that had never once failed her. "You'll know he trusts you," she said, snapping off her gloves, "the day he barks at something and expects you to come." Weston did not tell her that he understood, with an intimacy that embarrassed him, exactly what she meant. The weeks that followed reshaped the small apartment above the chandlery into something it had not been since Anaki's photographs still hung on the walls instead of facing them toward the plaster. Weston found himself talking to Rook the way he had once talked to men under his command, low and even, giving instructions the dog could not yet understand, but seemed to find steadying anyway. He found himself, against every habit of the last 2 years, opening the curtains in the morning because Rook liked to watch the gulls working the harbor. He found himself, for the first time since the funeral, cooking food that took longer than 11 minutes to prepare, because a dog recovering from near starvation needed a proper routine, and somewhere in building that routine for Rook, Weston accidentally built one for himself as well. Downstairs, Jonah and Lucy Fenwick, 7 and 5, pressed their faces to the stairwell window every time they heard Weston's door open, whispering theories about the new dog with the seriousness of diplomats. Their mother, a widow herself, kept them at a polite distance out of respect for a man the whole street had quietly agreed to leave alone, until the afternoon Rook, 3 weeks into his recovery, wandered halfway down the stairs on legs still uncertain and put his nose directly against the crack under their door. Lucy shrieked with delight loud enough that Weston heard it through his own floorboards, and something in him, some old rusted mechanism he had assumed permanently seized, turned over for the first time in longer than he could count. "He likes you," Weston told her, standing awkwardly in the stairwell while Rook accepted an ungainly amount of patting from a 5-year-old with complete, uncomplicated joy. "Everybody likes me," Lucy said with the total confidence of the very young, and Weston laughed, a short, surprised sound that felt strange in his own throat like a language he hadn't spoken in years. It was Doris who noticed first that something in him had shifted, though being Doris, she did not remark on it directly. She began leaving a second cup on her step in the mornings, unlabeled, wordless, and Weston began, without ever discussing it, sitting on the bottom stair to drink it with her before his walk, Rook stretched across both their feet like he'd been assigned the job of keeping them there. The second storm came in mid-March, faster and meaner than any forecast had predicted, the kind of nor'easter that Cape Breton old-timers measure other storms against for the rest of their lives. Weston had gone out only briefly, to move the truck off the exposed side of the lot, and in the 90 seconds the porch door had swung open behind him, Rook, spooked by a transformer exploding 2 streets over in a shower of blue sparks, bolted. What followed was the worst 40 minutes of Weston's life since Kandahar, and he would later admit, quietly to Fiona, that the comparison was not an exaggeration. He went out into whiteout conditions in a t-shirt, did not feel the cold, did not think about the cold, moved through the storm, calling a name that the wind kept tearing out of his mouth before it could travel more than a few feet. Doris came out onto her step in her housecoat, shouting for him to take a coat, to take a light, and when he did not stop, she did something that surprised even her. She picked up her phone and called 6 neighbors in 11 minutes, and by the time Fiona Doucet's truck came sliding up the unplowed street with its hazards flashing, half of Harrows Bay was already out in the storm, calling one dog's name into a darkness that did not want to give him back. They found him 40 minutes later, in the lee of an overturned dory behind the old chandlery, pressed as small as he could make himself, shaking but alive, and when Weston's flashlight found him, Rook did not simply come. He barked. One short, sharp, furious bark, the first sound Weston had ever heard him make, as if to say that he had been waiting, that the waiting had been unbearable, that someone had finally come. Weston went down on his knees in the snow and did not get up for a long time. Around him, in the wind and the sting of the storm, half the street stood watching a grown man hold a shaking dog against his chest and weep. Not the careful, rationed grief he had permitted himself exactly once in a parking lot 3 years earlier, but something looser, fuller, the kind of crying that empties a person out so that something new has room to fill the space. Nobody said anything about it afterward. That, too, was a kind of maritime mercy. By the time the daffodils came up along the harbor road, Rook had become something close to a town fixture, trotting the breakwater each morning at Weston's heel, greeting the fishing boats with a low, contented sound rather than the wary silence of his first weeks. He barked now, freely, at gulls and at the mail truck and at Jonah's increasingly elaborate games of fetch, and each time he did, Doris would call out from her window, half scolding, half delighted, that the whole street had heard him, "Thank you very much," and Weston would only smile and keep walking. Fiona stopped by one evening in late April with paperwork that did not, strictly, need to be delivered in person, and found Weston on the porch with Rook stretched across his boots, the harbor turning gold below them. "You know," she said, leaning on the rail, "when I sent you that photo, I figured you for a donation and a polite no. Didn't expect you'd drive up the Cabot in an ice storm for a dog you'd never met." Weston looked down at Rook, who lifted his head at the sound of his own unspoken name, ears swiveling with the particular alertness of an animal who has learned, finally, that being noticed is safe. "I thought I was doing him a favor," Weston said. "Turns out it went the other way." He did not explain further, and Fiona, wisely, did not ask him to. Some things in a small town did not need explaining. They only needed witnessing, and the whole street had already done that, out in the snow, calling a dog's name into the dark until it came home. That night, after Fiona's truck had pulled away and the harbor lights had come on. One by one along the water, Weston sat on the porch step with his hand resting on the warm, steady rise and fall of Rook's ribs and thought, without the old flinch that usually accompanied the thought, of a necky, of a promise made in a hospital room, of water and home, and the particular grace of things arriving exactly when a person has stopped believing they will. He had come to Nova Scotia carrying a promise he wasn't sure he had the strength to keep. He had not expected the keeping of it to arrive on 4 legs, half frozen, in the corner of a collapsing lobster pound, needing him exactly as badly as he had needed something to need him. Down the street, a light came on in the Fenwick's kitchen. Somewhere out on the black water, a boat's running lights blinked steady against the dark. Rook lifted his head, looked out over the harbor as though counting the lights the way Weston sometimes did, and gave one soft, easy bark. Not fear this time, not warning, just a dog announcing, simply, that he was here, and that here, at last, was somewhere worth announcing.